Hello and welcome back to Understanding Pliosaurs with Dr. Judith Sassoon. Welcome to episode 7. Today we'll be exploring pliosaur behaviour and how we can speculate on such things. This series is sponsored by the Ruskin Mill Trust, who is an educational charity that operates in England, Scotland and Wales. They offer exciting outdoor learning environments and utilise practical land and craft activities to support the development of work and life skills in young people with autism and other learning difficulties. I will be your host, Ash Hall. For this series, I'm joined by Dr. Judith Sassoon, paleobiologist and pliosaur expert from Bristol University.
Hi again, Ash.
Lovely to see you again, Judith.
Good to see you again.
Previously, Judith, we've discussed the different methods in which we can understand animals of the past. Through analogues, direct fossil evidence, and our understanding of anatomies. However, we're delving into the kind of speculative things here when we talk about behaviour. So, the stuff we've discussed before, how much do they come into play when we're trying to understand their behaviour?
So rather a lot, I would say. I think that we can make speculations in paleontology. In fact, we should speculate in paleontology. I would say make reasonable speculations on the grounds that they are the means by which we can propose hypotheses, and then we can look for evidence to see if there's any contradictory evidence for the hypotheses that we think are correct. So the sort of evidence for behaviour is exactly the same as for anything else that we're asking in paleontology. We're looking at fossil evidence primarily, but also anatomical comparisons and analogical reasoning. We're definitely using that. And we make educated, well-reasoned, I won't say guesses, but certainly sort of speculations. And we also look at trace fossils at times to work out behaviour. And indeed, there's also experimental work which we incorporate into this. So there's really quite a lot of lines of evidence that we use, even for something as apparently remote as behaviour. Obviously, this is something living animals do. What can we know about behaviour from fossils? Well, as I say, using certain methods, there's quite a lot we can know.
The thing about behaviour is, from my interactions with people around this subject, is it's one of the more contentious issues within paleontology, in that the people sit on both sides of, we should base it off of animal behaviour, but then they will, slightly away from pliosaurs, watch some things like Prehistoric Planet, and some of the behaviour seems a bit exuberant, for a better word. But there's no reason it couldn't be, is there? Because, as you mentioned, we're using the evidence that we have plus realistic behaviours of modern animals. So as much as it's a kind of contentious issue, paleontology doesn't branch further than it should when it comes to animal behaviour, does it?
I don't think we speculate unduly. I think that the kind of speculations we make are always constrained, are always on the basis of something, and there is a reason behind it. Or shall I say, in general, we don't speculate unduly. There's usually a whole sort of line of reasoning why we may think that something is a certain way.
One of the things I can't remember who the conversation was with, but one of the conversations I've actually had with someone who works in that field was perhaps that we don't speculate enough. Is that possibly the case?
Yeah, I would say so, actually, sometimes. As long as we know that's exactly what we're doing. I think that researchers in the field, in paleontology, know exactly what they're doing in terms of speculating, and then we know how far, that it's a hypothesis that needs to be disproved or proved, and that's what it is. It's not a fact that we absolutely know. Although in science, actually, there is no such thing as a fact that we absolutely know. Everything is there to be falsified.
So, Judith, in science, experiments come into play a lot in various different disciplines. Is that something that we utilise in paleontology?
Yes, so people quite often think of science as actually defined by the fact that experiments can be done. And one of the problems here is that we can't do experiments, as it were, on the past, or not direct experiments on the past. But what we can do, and this has particularly been developed in the last few years, is we are able to model now, and we are able to use the fantastic amount of computing power that we have to generate three-dimensional models and moving models and this sort of thing. And such modeling now enables us to make to actually do experiments, to propose hypotheses, and to see if they are reasonable, if they can be falsified or not. Now, one of the things that has happened in terms of understanding pliosaur behaviour or animal behaviour in general is that we can generate these models and make digital reconstructions and even do what is called finite element analysis, which is where you create these models and apply forces to for example, to simulate how much force a jaw would be exposed to during feeding, or jaws would be exposed to during feeding, and then to see whether they could function under certain loads or not under other loads. So biting and locomotion can be inferred from such information, from such data. So biomechanical work, I would argue, does use experimental principles. However, these experiments are done on models and not directly on animals, which would not be possible in the case of extinct creatures, of course. So functional anatomy, biomechanics, all of these disciplines use experimental reasoning. Also, robot models have been built recently for plesiosaurs. They've been made at Imperial College. A gentleman I know called Luke Muscat has been involved in creating such models. He's exploring how pliosaurs swim, and he's using robots. You can also use 3D computer-generated models to ask questions about motion and locomotion as well. So there's a lot of scope for asking questions and for answering them in an experimental format.
And I suppose following that then, as technology develops further, we'll be able to experiment in more ways than we currently can. So
yes,
you mentioned...
I do think so. But I also think it's important to always bring it back to that initial engagement with the fossils themselves. So from the fossils, for example, we can see muscle scars on skulls, let's say, or on other parts of the body, if you're talking about vertebrates. And these muscle scars, they indicate muscle attachments. So already you're starting to build up a soft tissue picture, so a picture beyond what you can actually find in the fossil record. You can build up a picture. And from that, you can also integrate that into the modeling, and then the sort of experiments that you're doing, in a sense, are using the material and the additional power of the computing models.
With all that evidence to consider then, we can get a, let's say, fair idea about certain behaviours. But the first one I'm going to come on to is, I think, one of the ones I'm most asked, and it's about how do pliosaurs hunt?
Right. So we've got, again, the kinds of pliosaurs that we discussed last time. The thalassophonians, the true pliosaurs, but we also discussed last time that within that group we have large-headed ambush predators, but also, it would seem, smaller polycotylid-like pliosaurs, which belong within the thalassophonid group. That are obviously doing a different kind of hunting. So there's probably more diversity than we are at the moment we have considered up to now. But I think if you're talking about the large pliosaurs, which I suppose is what people are quite interested in, then we've got a body structure which suggests ambush predation potentially, or a sort of pursuit predation. So there's always a kind of argument between one or the other. Certainly, the biomechanics has been done on the bite forces of these animals. They did have the potential to bite very hard bite force, but at the same time, their skulls were not really structured such that the maximum bite forces could be used, and there's a kind of balance between the potential for a large and strong bite, balanced against a sort of hydrodynamic shape which they need to have. So there's this interaction which would suggest that they were out there pursuing their prey, utilizing their hydrodynamic shapes to help them. So that's one thing that has been concluded so far. And your question, I think, was, did they, what kind of feeding or what?
Specifically, I get asked fairly often about the way in which they hunt. It's a very general question. The BBC created a fantastic CGI representation of the ways whoever they consulted imagined that hunt could, the hunt between our pliosaur and an ichthyosaur could have gone.
And when you say our pliosaur, you mean the one
yes.
which is famous in the gallery and which has become a celebrity recently?
Attenborough's giant sea monster, yes.
Right, okay.
And an ichthyosaur could have, how that interaction could have gone.
Yeah.
But that would be one way of, that's one representation of one possible hunt. But when it comes to these things, animals will find different ways of capturing whichever prey they're going after. And I wondered how much thought that had been given. Has it been considered that they might hunt in plesiosaurs in different ways to ichthyosaurs, or what those kind of hunting techniques might look like? Specifically, one of the questions I have been asked is it possible that pliosaurs could have rammed their prey?
Right, so the ramming behaviour, I think, is something that we know about from sharks, isn't that right? Or possibly
Orcas
certain kinds of
sharks,
whales. Yeah. I mean, I can't answer that. It would seem to me that for a pliosaur to lurk at the in the benthic region at the bottom of the ocean and to look upwards to see what was available, it is a possibility because its eyes are such that it has a wide range of vision and could certainly be aware of what's going on above. Plus the fact that if they lived in shallow seas, so the sunlight would be coming in from the top, and the shadow of a possible prey item would stimulate the pliosaur to think, right, I'm off to hunt that from below. Yeah, so that might be one way. And I expect probably they just utilised whatever was available at the time. If they happen to be at the bottom and there's a prey item and they're hungry, they will go for it. And they would use their speed and their strength to get what they needed. I think it's fairly clear from fossil evidence that they did eat large prey items. The fossils in this museum, in the Etches Museum, show that. We've got plenty of bite marks from large pliosaurs on the paddles of all sorts of marine reptiles, so other marine reptiles, including other plesiosaurians, in fact, and pliosaurs. So there was a lot of interaction of that kind, I think, between large prey items. But we also must consider, if we're talking about pliosaurs, that we're not just thinking about big ones. So the thalassophonid group includes also slightly smaller pliosaurs from the Oxford clay, from the Calovian. And there may have been different techniques. So we know, for example, that Pelaneustes, with its rather elongate jaw, would be hunting fish rather than large prey items, or presumably fish, rather than the large prey items, and would probably could be modelled on crocodiles such as the gharial in its form. Then there are also some other interesting lines of evidence, including stomach contents from some of the Oxford clay pliosaurs. So a creature I've been studying has stomach contents, which suggests that it was eating squid, so it has squid hooklets preserved in the stomach. But alongside those, it has also this kind of siliceous material, so it's got gravel in its stomach, for example, which suggests that it was taking in gravel as it was feeding. And another line of, so here we have also an example of how different lines of evidence can lead to hypotheses. So there we have one set of one hypothesis. The other thing about this particular specimen is it has a lot of wear on its teeth, suggesting that it might have been crunching gravel. And then another line of evidence, which is something which was done in the 1990s by a Swiss author. He described traces in the cliff of Switzerland, in the Swiss cliff, which is in Oxford clay strata, and suggests, sort of like long gutters, suggests a sort of a possible formation of these gutters by the snout of a hunting creature, like a pliosaur. It's about the right sort of size. So they would have been sort of dragging their snouts through the gravel at the bottom of the ocean in order to, for example, eat squid. Now, there are examples of extant squid that, in fact, bury themselves in the sand, so it's possible that this is exactly what was happening. But this is a speculation, but it's a reasonable one. You know, we have trace evidence of a certain kind of feeding, potentially by a pliosaur. We have stomach contents, and we have tooth wear. Other line of evidence, perhaps a little bit more tentative here, is whether they were deeper divers or not. There are signs of what's called avascular necrosis, which is when blood flow is in some ways obscured to the joints or to regions of the bones, and we have that might lead to a weakening of the internal bone structure, which could lead to bone collapse. And Bruce Rothschild, again, I think it was in the 1990s, proposed, or maybe earlier, proposed that there was some signs that due to conditions such as the bends, which divers experience if they rise too fast from a deep dive, that sort of blockage in the circulation due to nitrogen coming out of solution might be creating or causing the avascular necrosis. So a possible sign of deeper diving and a condition associated with that. So several lines of evidence suggesting possibly a bottom feeder at times, not necessarily always. So different kinds of feeding, different kinds of animals or animal forms associated with different forms of feeding.
You've touched on a couple of things which I find quite intriguing there. Firstly, you mentioned bottom feeding for squid. It's just made me think that presumably, as there are today, you'd have had various different flatfish. We know guitar fish and some of the earlier rays would have been bottom feeding anyway, so potentially they would have been prey items there. Do we have any evidence for the kind of fish eating as well, or is it just
there
squid?
were fish bones in some of the stomach contents I looked at, but it's hard to say what.
Fair enough. And the other thing that's kind of crossed my mind is when we find evidence like that, where you found bits of gravel in this animal's stomach, is that something that you would conclude as a potentially a species-wide behaviour or as an individual's behaviour?
It might be that it was across species, in fact. If you've got a number of these sort of longer snouted, smallish Oxford clay pliosaurs, they might have been indulging in this sort of behaviour, all of them, for whatever reason, if they liked squid, for example. So it doesn't have to be individual, but it can actually go further.
Yeah. Wonderful. So on the note of smaller pliosaurs, could they take prey bigger than themselves, like orcas will sometimes take sperm whale, for example?
Well, yes, for that reason, I would say probably yes. If they could manage it, they would manage it, maybe.
Well, this is the way I view the hunting behaviour, and well, with all animals actually. In my mind, all animals are opportunistic feeders. They will take what's available to them. So I assume it would have been the same with these in their hunting. If it was there and they believed they could have done it, they would have tried, in my mind. So let's move away from the feeding and go to, I suppose, the opposite end of the spectrum. Instead of the end of life, the beginning of life. Birth.
Yes.
Pliosaurs gave birth to live young is the current theory, isn't it? So what does that actually mean, and how does that compare to other reptiles?
We need to consider a few things here. So the evidence for plesiosaurians giving birth to live young comes from a single specimen of a polycotylid plesiosaurian. Now, if we recall our last episode, the polycotylids had a body plan which was pliosauromorph. So that's one thing to consider. But the second thing to consider is there is one specimen and no others. And this is very odd, considering that in ichthyosaurs we have multiple specimens suggesting live birth. And also in the earlier plesiosaurians, there are examples of both live birth and also some form of egg development. Now, when we talk about live birth in reptiles, we're thinking of possibly something called ovovivipary, which is when the eggs, in fact, are not laid, but they develop within the body of the mother and hatch internally. But there is in some reptiles also a form of something rather similar to a placental birth. Now, in this polycotylid, what we have is we've got a specimen with the skeleton of an undeveloped young creature inside an area which is presumably the womb or whatever it is that this thing would have instead a uterus. And the questions around that, because it's sort of in the stomach area, the questions were, is this in fact what we think it is? Is it evidence of internal gestation? Or do we have just the remains of somebody's meal, of the animal's meal? The conclusion is it's probably not something that the animal fed on, because the specimen inside the alleged mother is not developed enough. It's still in its embryonic stage of development. So that's the line of evidence. All right, so we can accept that. It is not unusual for reptiles to bear live young. Sea snakes do, many sea snakes do, and other reptiles do as well. And of course, if you have a life at sea, if you are an animal that spends all its life in the water, it would be the sensible option. We don't have the recent thinking is that we do not really imagine that the plesiosaurians could have crawled out onto the land because of their body plans and the forces involved in doing that. I think that's something we'll discuss in another episode potentially. So that it's not that. And so how would they have dealt with the problem of reproduction? Well, it would seem that vivipary or ovovivipary would be an option. Now, the other curious thing about this one polycotylid specimen is that it seems to be that it's only one young in its uterus. And it's that would suggest a form of reproduction which is somewhat akin to that which is observed in whales, in mammals, where you have what is called K-selected behaviour, which means very few young and parental teaching or parental care associated with that. The other type of selection is R selection, when you have plenty of young and the parents don't invest so much time in bringing them up as well. So we have some lines of quite interesting evidence there, but it is just one specimen, and it's in the polycotylid group, which are distantly related to the thalassophonians. So we don't know for a fact, but we can reasonably presume that it was a feature of the whole group, of plesiosaurians, rather.
This particular line of evidence we have is this one polycotylid with a single fetus. And that would indicate a certain type of birthing, the type of birthing which would often have support from a parent once born. So what is the likelihood that with that kind of birth then you'd have a pliosaur nursing in some form its young?
So can you tell me what you mean by nursing? Because for me there's a very sort of specific behaviour which means nursing, which is something that mammals do. And is that what you mean, or do you just mean parental care?
Well, generically I meant parental care, but while we're going down that road, then of specifics, things I'm imagining is not just teaching learned behaviors such as how to hunt and how to exist within this newfound world that this juvenile has come into, but also would there be potential for aid in feeding as well?
There might be potential for protection, actually, here. I mean, if you're a large pliosaur and you only have a few young, let's say, obviously when they emerge, they would be potential victims of other large pliosaurs. That's making an assumption that they would be feeding on themselves as well, on cannibalism, but it is a possibility. So some form of protection, parental protection, would be sensible in that situation. Also, I suppose there would be a need or a necessity to teach them to protect themselves and of course how to feed and on what on what to feed. So that's what I would imagine could potentially happen.
Yeah, so it's a very, again, a lot of this is up to kind of, interpretation, I suppose. But it's one of those where it's a question that I wish we could understand better, where because of the lack of direct evidence, it's difficult to know, and it's all based off of what's around us today. But yeah, in my mind, I was specifically curious, as you said, about how they may look after and teach, and whether such things would be not like birds regurgitating food or whatever, but maybe killing and bringing food back, or killing and protecting food sources for them, potentially, that sort of thing.
Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, I really...
Yeah, again, it's very much difficult to interpret, isn't it?
What would also play into this would be also social behaviour, and whether they would be protective as a group, or whether they would be just as an individual parent or a pair of parents and a young. Unlike with dinosaurs, where we do have traces for herding behaviour, because we're talking about marine animals, there is no trace evidence for any sort of group activity. That would be very hard to work out how such evidence could actually arise. So that's an unknown, and consistently an unknown, unfortunately, at the moment.
Okay, a slight different take on that then. As much as we know they're large, top of the food chain predators, sharks are solitary, large, top of the food chain predators. They only really interact to mate. However, the apex predator of our oceans today is a social creature, which is the orca. So it's, in the case with these larger pliosaurs, the size and evidence of them being these, well, public assumption of them being giant killing machines doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't social creatures. And there is all possibility that they could have been engaging in those sorts of group behaviours, I suppose.
I would agree with that, actually, yes. I don't see why not. But again, I don't know what more to say on that matter at the moment.
There isn't much more we can say, I suppose, other than that it's a possibility they would have been, or they could have been grouping. And we know, at least I believe there's evidence of ichthyosaurs performing group behaviour.
Do you know what that evidence is?
No, I don't. Let's say there's hearsay of ichthyosaurs performing grouping behaviour, probably based off of the assumption that they're very dolphin-like and there are so many found that they're just so common that it would seem logical.
Yeah, that would really be the only line of evidence I could think of.
If we move away from the social side, which we, again, can't say much about because of lack of evidence, but we can think about based off of those analogues that we have, what's the potential that these animals might have been moving between saltwater and freshwater?
That's a good one. So I think there is some evidence that that there were groups within the Plesiosauria that did that. The leptocleidids being the obvious one, the best known. There was also something I heard about Romaleosaurs, but I really don't know very much more about that. As for pliosaurs, the thalassophonians, well, I would think the large ones probably didn't. They are found generally in ocean sediments. Perhaps some of the smaller ones might have. I really not sure about that. But the leptocleidids are interesting, but they are plesiosaurians, and also some of them take on pliosaur proportions. So there is some evidence that we have pliosaur-like creatures that perhaps behaved like some of the river dolphins that we have, that are becoming rarer and rarer today.
Yeah, there is that. So that leaves the possibility again. It's one of those where I suppose lack of direct evidence is the issue with making any grand assumptions about that. But it's not to say part of the extended family weren't behaving in such ways where they might have been engaging in behaviours in fresh water. So that's the scripted questions out of the way, Judith. So I'm going to ask you something unscripted and entirely speculative. Mm-hmm. If you take you back into a kind of fiction world of the Jurassic, if you were to paint or imagine a scene with pliosaurs, how would you depict them behaving? What, like, fully go as wild as you like. What would you imagine if you were watching a scene in the ocean? What would they be doing? How would they be behaving?
In my imagination, they are generally solitary, but that may be completely false. But that is how I would imagine them. Solitary, or at least with sort of very few, if a group, a family group, possibly, very small groups. And pretty much behaving in the way we discussed, sort of lurking either in sort of shallow waters at the bottom or sort of rising to the top. They obviously had to breathe, so that's something else we didn't mention in terms of behaviour. They did have to breathe. So if they lurked at the bottom, they would spend some time there, but not all the time there. So unlike sharks, and they had to rise to the surface to breathe. They might have fed at the surface, meaning that they would pursue it so close to the surface as well. But as I imagine them, I generally don't imagine them hunting, to be fair. I generally just imagine them swimming.
Fair enough. So you're right, we didn't mention breathing. So that behaviour, is that concluded? That's presumed off of other evidence of other reptiles, or is that
they needed air?
That they, well, yes, we assume that, yeah.
That they breathed in the way that, let's say, other reptiles today. But yeah, that is, I would say, pretty conclusive. Yeah. They had lungs.
Yes. So, again, entirely interpretive. But presumably, with the size of the animal they are and the behaviours that we imagine they may be undertaking, fast pursuit, predatory behaviour, presumably they would have been able to stay underwater for a long time, and they wouldn't have been just under the surface breathing every minute or two.
They might well have been able to stay under the surface for a fair amount of time, but although I don't really know what that amount of time would be.
No, we couldn't possibly say.
And it might be there's some evidence that they might have had warm blood. I think we talked about this, which would already mean that a higher level of oxygen is needed in such animals. So the whales stay under for 20 minutes, half an hour at times?
I can tell you something
I remember
like that
in my whale watching days. Yeah, we waited for the fin whale to come up, and it was about 20 minutes. I remember waiting in the boat. So possibly that amount of time, but again, I guess.
Yeah, based off modern analogues.
And they didn't have watches in those days anyway.
they weren't timing themselves, no. Not like us. We can't understand the behaviours of these animals particularly well, but if you could find evidence for any particular behaviour, what's the behaviour you'd like to most understand from these animals?
I'd like to know how they perceived their environment. So that's the sort of sensory question. But it's a little bit more than that, because it's a question I have for living animals as well. A question of how animals understand their what's called in German the Umwelt, the environment in which they find themselves. You know, what does it mean to them? That's really the question that would, if I could have an answer to that, that's the one that I would find most interesting.
I suppose that's a very, very good thought, actually. It's like, what would life look like?
What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be a pliosaur? Yeah.
What is it like to be a pliosaur?
Experience?
I think that makes I think that's a good place to wrap this episode up. But I look forward to what the future brings in this regard, and I hope that with the technologies we have and the way we can visualize these things, we might truly get a picture for how, as you put it, what it's like to be a pliosaur. This has been Understanding Pliosaurs with Dr. Judith Sassoon. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.